The pediatrician's office smelled of antiseptic and the particular sadness that comes from delivering news that rewrites futures. Dr. Margaret Chen sat across from Rachel Torres with a folder thick enough to contain tragedy, her expression carrying the weight of words she'd delivered too many times, but never grew comfortable speaking. Mrs. Torres, the genetic testing confirms what the developmental assessment suggested. Your son has Down syndrome, Trisomy 21. We'll need to discuss early intervention therapies, specialist referrals, and long-term care planning. Rachel heard the words through a fog that made everything seem distant and underwater. Beside her in the carrier, 3-month-old Daniel slept with a profound peace of infants who don't yet understand that the world has decided they're different. His features, the upward slant to his eyes, the slight flattening of his face, the characteristics she'd noticed but hadn't wanted to name, suddenly carried medical terminology that felt like verdict rather than description. Michael's hand withdrew from hers. Not dramatically, not with obvious rejection, just a subtle pulling away that communicated everything his silence confirmed. Her husband of 4 years, the man who'd promised partnership and permanence, was already calculating exit strategies. The drive home passed in silence, broken only by Daniel's occasional contented noises. Rachel watched Portland's familiar streets blur past the window, each landmark now seeming to belong to a different life, the one where her son would develop typically and her marriage would survive beyond its first real test. Michael lasted 3 weeks, 21 days of watching him retreat emotionally before retreating physically, coming home later each night, avoiding eye contact with Daniel, speaking to Rachel in monosyllables that didn't require real conversation. The divorce papers arrived with the casual cruelty of something done by professionals who treated family dissolution as routine administrative work. The attorney's explanation came with practiced sympathy that fooled no one. Mr. Torres is willing to waive custody claims in exchange for minimal child support obligations. Given Daniel's diagnosis and anticipated care needs, he's arguing that his financial contribution would be more valuable than parental involvement. Translation: Michael wanted no part of raising a disabled child and was willing to pay money to make that abandonment legal. Rachel signed the papers in a coffee shop because she couldn't afford the attorney's office fees for extended meetings. $400 monthly child support, laughable given Michael's software engineer salary, but fighting would cost more than she'd win. The pen felt heavy, each signature marking the end of promises that had included in sickness and in health, but apparently contained unspoken asterisks about acceptable types of sickness. Her mother's reaction came swift and unambiguous, delivered over the phone in a voice that combined disappointment with something harder. Rachel, I love you, but I can't support this decision. Raising a special needs child alone? That's not fair to you or to him. There are facilities, programs, people trained for this. You're being selfish keeping him when you can't provide proper care. He's 3 months old, Mom. He's my son. He's going to need care you can't afford, attention you can't provide, specialists you can't access. And you'll sacrifice your entire future for what? Maternal stubbornness. The call ended with Rachel's throat tight and her mother's judgment hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. The suggestion wasn't new. Friends had hinted. Strangers in grocery stores had offered unsolicited advice about options. But hearing it from her own mother transformed the pressure from external noise into weight that pressed directly on her chest. She looked at Daniel, awake now and watching her with eyes that saw without judgment, and felt certainty settle beneath the fear. Some things weren't negotiable. Some bonds didn't break because circumstances grew difficult. The apartment lease expired at a time when rent increases made renewal impossible. Rachel's job as a dental hygienist paid $42,000 annually before taxes. Decent money for a single person, barely adequate for a mother with a child requiring regular specialist appointments, therapy sessions, and medical supplies insurance covered only partially. The eviction notice came with 30 days to vacate, neutral language that made homelessness sound like a bureaucratic transition rather than catastrophe. She called every contact, every friend, every distant relative, searching for temporary housing that might bridge the gap between eviction and finding something affordable. The responses ranged from sympathetic refusals to suggestions she consider adoption or foster care, as though Daniel were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be protected. Her car became home with the grim efficiency of desperation. A 2012 Honda Civic packed with essentials: diapers, formula, clothes, the few toys Daniel recognized. She parked in different lots each night, rotating between grocery stores and public parks, places where security wouldn't immediately call police about a woman living in her vehicle with an infant. The library provided daytime refuge. Air conditioning in summer, warmth in winter, bathrooms with changing tables and sinks for improvised baths. Rachel brought books. She couldn't focus on reading while Daniel lay on a blanket, reaching for toys with the concentrated effort that characterized his development. Slower than typical, but progressing, learning, becoming. Other patrons noticed. Some offered kindness, others judgment masked as concern. A librarian named Patricia began setting aside the corner table, making it available without saying explicitly that she understood what Rachel's presence meant. Small mercies that kept dignity intact when circumstances tried stripping it away. The nights were harder. Daniel's cries in the confined car space amplified into sounds that seemed certain to attract attention. Rachel drove when he wouldn't settle, burning gas she couldn't afford, circling blocks while singing lullabies that her grandmother had taught her decades earlier. Songs about mountains and valleys and streams that flowed despite obstacles. Money disappeared faster than income arrived. Car insurance, $140 monthly. Gas, $200. Diapers and formula, $180. Cell phone, $45. Essential for job communication and specialist appointments. The math allowed no room for error, no unexpected expenses, no margin between survival and complete collapse. Daniel's 6-month checkup brought news that required decisions Rachel couldn't afford to make. Early intervention therapy recommended 3 times weekly at $120 per session after insurance. Specialist referrals for cardiology and gastroenterology to monitor complications common with Down syndrome. Equipment recommendations, special bottles, positioning aids, developmental toys designed for his specific needs. Dr. Martinez delivered the information with kindness that acknowledged the impossibility of compliance. I know resources are limited, but these interventions make significant difference in developmental outcomes. Is there any way to access additional support? Rachel wanted to laugh or scream or something between. Additional support required family or community or systems designed to help, none of which had materialized despite desperate attempts to access them. She took the referral papers and prescription recommendations and added them to the folder of things she couldn't afford but desperately needed. The letter arrived on a Thursday in October, forwarded through 3 previous addresses before reaching the library where Patricia held Rachel's mail. The envelope bore a law firm's return address, heavy paper that suggested expense beyond Rachel's reach. Inside, documents stamped with county seals explained that Rosa Elena Mendoza, Rachel's maternal grandmother, whom she remembered only dimly from childhood visits, had died 6 months earlier. Estate settlement had been delayed due to difficulties locating heirs. As sole surviving descendant, Rachel was entitled to property located outside the city limits, classified in records as residential structure in need of substantial repair. The attached photograph showed something that barely qualified as structure. Stone walls rising from overgrown land, windows boarded or missing entirely, roofs sagging under weather damage that decades of neglect had inflicted. The place looked less like inheritance and more like liability, abandoned architecture slowly surrendering to entropy. A second page detailed the complications. Property taxes owed, $12,000, accumulated over 15 years of non-payment. Condemnation proceedings initiated by the county. Structure deemed unsafe for habitation. Demolition scheduled pending estate resolution. Legal fees for transferring title, $3,500. Rachel sat in the library's corner, Daniel sleeping in his carrier beside her, calculated impossibilities. She had $847 in her checking account. Her car needed brake work she'd been delaying. Winter was approaching, making car living progressively more dangerous for an infant. But the structure existed. It had walls and a roof, however compromised. It represented something other than parking lots and bathroom sinks, and the daily terror of someone calling Child Protective Services because a baby shouldn't be living in a vehicle. Patricia noticed her staring at the documents. "What's that?" "My grandmother's house." "Sort of. More like ruins with a property deed attached." The librarian leaned closer, examining the photograph. "That's old construction. Looks like it might be one of those stone cottages from the early 1900s. Those foundations are solid, even when everything else falls apart. It's condemned. Needs thousands in repairs I can't afford. Property taxes I definitely can't pay. But it's yours." The question hung between them, simple and complicated. Legal ownership without resources to claim it. Inheritance that felt more like curse than gift. That night, parked behind a closed shopping center, Rachel made lists by phone light while Daniel slept. Option 1. Ignore the inheritance. Let the county demolish the structure. Continue living in the car until something broke. Her health, her job, the vehicle, Daniel's development delayed beyond recovery. Option 2. Attempt to claim the property despite impossibility. Somehow find money for taxes and repairs. Transform ruins into shelter through force of will and desperation. Neither option seemed viable. Both seemed better than surrendering Daniel to the system that viewed disability as burden and maternal poverty as failure. She called the law office Friday morning. The attorney, Thomas Brennan, spoke with the careful distance of someone explaining options while disclaiming liability for outcomes. "Ms. Torres, I must be frank. The structure is uninhabitable in its current state. Even accessing the property requires navigating overgrown land without proper roadway. The county's condemnation isn't arbitrary. There are legitimate safety concerns. Additionally, the tax debt means the county could seize the property through foreclosure proceedings. You'd be assuming significant liability for minimal benefit. What if I don't claim it? The property reverts to county ownership after 90 days. They'll demolish the structure, clear the land, eventually auction it for back taxes. You walk away with nothing, but also no obligation." Rachel watched Daniel through the rearview mirror, his small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of sleep that trusted her completely to make choices that serve his interests over her comfort. "I want to see it first, before deciding." Silence stretched while the attorney processed her response. "I can provide directions, but I'd recommend against taking a child. The site presents multiple hazards. Where else would he be? I don't have child care. I barely have anything else." The directions took her east from Portland, following highways that thinned into county roads that degraded into gravel paths marked on GPS but barely visible on the ground. The Honda protested as pavement became dirt, as smooth became rutted, as civilization gave way to empty land that looked like it had been specifically forgotten. 40 minutes passed where her phone lost signal. The structure materialized like something from a fairy tale written by pessimists. Stone walls dark with age, and weather damage rose 3 stories from ground that had gone wild with decades of neglect. The roof pitched steeply, but sagged in the middle where supports had failed. Windows gaped empty on the upper floors, boarded with rotting plywood on the ground level. A door hung crookedly from rusted hinges, partially open, revealing darkness beyond. The surrounding land stretched empty in all directions. No neighbors, no services, no infrastructure suggesting anyone had lived here recently or planned to return. Sage and wild grass grew waist-high, concealing whatever paths or gardens might once have existed. Rachel killed the engine and sat staring at what her grandmother had left her. Not a house, a ruin, a problem requiring resources she didn't possess and solutions she couldn't imagine. Daniel woke, crying, hungry, pulling her back from paralysis into necessity. She fed him in the car, changed his diaper, talked to him in the sing-song voice that always calmed him. "This might be home, sweet boy. I know it doesn't look like much. Doesn't look like anything, really. But it has walls. It has a roof. and it's ours if we can figure out how to claim it. She approached cautiously, testing each step on ground that might conceal holes or hazards. The door opened with a sound like grief, hinges screaming protest against movement. Inside, darkness gradually revealed itself as single large room. Stone floor covered in debris, walls stained by water damage, ceiling crossed with exposed beams that looked surprisingly solid despite the roof's external deterioration. A fireplace dominated one wall, massive stone construction with a chimney that rose through the upper floors. Beside it, a narrow staircase climbed into darkness. The space smelled of abandonment, mildew and dust, and time's slow rot. But the walls stood straight. The foundation showed no cracks. The stones fit together with craftsmanship that predated modern construction techniques. Each piece selected and placed with intention that had outlasted the people who'd done the work. Rachel carried Daniel inside, his weight reassuring against her chest. She spoke aloud, needing to hear her own voice in the emptiness. "Grandma Rosa, I don't know if you can hear me, but I got your letter. I got your house, and I don't understand why you left it to me or how you expected me to do anything with it. But I'm here, and I'm going to try." The second floor revealed itself via stairs that creaked but held. 2 rooms divided by a partial wall, both with windows that once framed views but now framed only sky and overgrown land. More water damage, more debris, but the same solid construction. Walls that had weathered a century of neglect and still stood. The third floor was smallest, a single room under the peaked roof, where ceiling met walls at sharp angles that made standing difficult. A window here remained unboarded, letting afternoon light flood across floors scarred by bird droppings and weather that had entered through gaps in the roof. From this height, the land spread visible for miles. Empty, isolated, beautiful in the way that made people nervous if they weren't accustomed to silence. Rachel stood holding Daniel, looking out at territory that might become theirs or might remain forever beyond her ability to claim. "What do you think, baby? Can we make this work?" Daniel grabbed at her hair, his grip strong despite developmental delays that meant other milestones came slowly. His response meant nothing and everything. Presence without judgment, trust without condition, existence that demanded she at least try. The descent revealed details she'd missed in her initial survey. Built-in storage along one wall, doors hanging loose but compartments intact. A root cellar access through a trapdoor in the floor, surprisingly dry, suggesting drainage the builders had planned for. Small touches throughout that spoke of people who'd lived here with intention. Hooks for hanging tools or clothes, shelves carved directly into stone walls, a niche beside the fireplace perfect for keeping wood dry. Someone had loved this place, had built it to last, had cared enough to create details that served function and beauty both. Rachel emerged in a fading light and found herself making decisions before fully understanding what they meant. She couldn't afford the property taxes, couldn't fund repairs that would make the place habitable, couldn't solve any of the practical problems that made claiming this inheritance seem absurd. But she also couldn't return to parking lots and library bathrooms and the grinding fear that Child Protective Services would eventually intervene. Couldn't watch Daniel's development suffer because she lacked resources for therapy and equipment and the basic stability children required. The ruins offered possibility, however distant. They offered walls and roof and isolation that meant no neighbors to judge or report. They offered inheritance from a grandmother who must have understood something about survival and stubbornness and refusing to surrender. The drive back to Portland took longer, darkness transforming familiar roads into uncertain territory. Daniel slept in his carrier, exhausted by the day's disruption to routine. Rachel's mind raced through calculations that didn't add up but refused to be dismissed. She called the attorney Monday morning. "I want to claim the property. Ms. Torres, I must reiterate the challenges. I understand, but I still want it. What do I need to do?" The paperwork took a week to process. Rachel signed documents acknowledging she understood the structure's condition, the tax obligations, the county's concerns. She borrowed $2,000 from a payday lender at interest rates that would have been criminal in a more just system. money that barely covered initial legal fees and left nothing for actual repairs. The library became planning headquarters. Patricia helped research property rehabilitation programs, finding grant opportunities and nonprofit organizations that sometimes assisted with restoration costs. Most required matching funds Rachel didn't have, or timelines that assumed resources she couldn't access. But one possibility emerged: a state program for historic preservation that provided materials and expertise if owners contributed labor. The application required photographs, structural assessment, and documentation proving the building's historical significance. Rachel spent evenings photographing every angle of the ruins, searching county records for information about when and why her grandmother's house had been built, finding fragments that suggested early 1900s construction, possibly associated with homesteading families who'd settled the region before infrastructure made life convenient. Dr. Martinez listened to Rachel's plans during Daniel's 9-month checkup with an expression that combined concern and something like admiration. "You're moving to an unheated stone ruin an hour outside the city with a medically fragile infant." "He's not fragile. He's strong. And the alternative is my car, which is definitely less safe." The pediatrician made notes that Rachel couldn't see. Recommendations or concerns or judgments she'd face eventually. "The therapy services Daniel needs are all city-based. How will you access them from that location?" "I'll drive. I've been doing it anyway. And when winter hits, when the roads aren't passable." Rachel met her gaze directly. "Then we survive, like people did before modern medicine made everything convenient. We adapt, we manage, we do what's necessary." Dr. Martinez's expression softened. "I'm going to give you referrals for home-based therapy programs. More limited than clinic services, but better than nothing. And I want phone check-ins weekly. I know you're capable, Rachel, but I also know the system has failed you. Let me help where I can." The unexpected support made Rachel's throat tight. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep him safe. And call if you need anything, even just to talk." Isolation with an infant is hard enough without medical complexity added. The move happened over 3 days in late November. Rachel loaded everything she owned into the Honda and a borrowed trailer: clothes, Daniel supplies, camping equipment purchased from a secondhand store, tools salvaged from a neighbor's garage sale. The accumulated possessions of a life reduced to essentials fit easily, leaving space that felt like absence rather than opportunity. Friends who'd offered support but rarely delivered helped with loading, their expressions revealing doubts they tried masking with encouragement. Sarah, Rachel's co-worker from the dental office, spoke the concerns others implied. "Rachel, this is crazy. You're taking a baby into a condemned building an hour for medical care. What if something happens? What if Daniel needs emergency help? Then I drive fast and hope the hospitals work the way they're supposed to. That's not a plan. That's wishful thinking." Rachel secured a box of Daniel's clothes with force that wasn't entirely necessary. "You know what's not a plan, Sarah? Assuming help will materialize if I just wait patiently in approved places doing approved things." I waited. I applied for programs. I asked for assistance. And you know what I got? Suggestions that I give up my son because disability makes him inconvenient. So yeah, maybe moving to ruins is crazy. But staying where I was? That was impossible. The drive to the property felt longer than it had during her initial visit, complicated by the trailer's weight and growing certainty that she was making a mistake of spectacular proportions. But Daniel cooed from his car seat, reaching for the toys hanging within his grasp, existing in the moment without anxiety about future consequences. They arrived at dusk, the stone structure materializing from gathering darkness like something that had been waiting specifically for their return. Rachel parked close to the door, killed the engine, sat listening to silence that felt absolute after Portland's constant noise. "We're home, baby. This is it." She unloaded essentials first: camping stove, sleeping bags, battery power lanterns, food that wouldn't spoil quickly. The temperature inside the ruins hovered maybe 5 degrees warmer than outside. Not enough to matter, not enough to call comfort. The fireplace became immediate priority. Rachel had researched firewood procurement with the obsessive thoroughness of someone whose son's survival might depend on maintaining heat. Dead wood lay scattered across the property, fallen branches from trees she couldn't identify, aged enough to burn without extensive drying. She gathered armloads while Daniel napped, stacking it near the fireplace, testing the chimney's draw by burning paper and watching smoke disappear upward without backing into the room. The first fire took 3 attempts to establish, kindling too damp, technique unpracticed. But eventually flames caught and held, radiating heat that transformed the space from abandoned to occupied. Rachel arranged their sleeping bags near the hearth, creating a nest where Daniel would stay warm through the night. Darkness came completely, city light pollution absent, leaving only firelight and distant stars visible through gaps in the boarded windows. The isolation pressed against Rachel with physical weight, making her aware of how far they were from help, how complete their dependence on her capability to solve problems without backup. Daniel woke hungry at 9. Rachel fed him by firelight, changed his diaper, sang the lullabies that had become ritual. His eyes tracked flames with fascination, small hands reaching toward light and warmth that made their situation feel less desperate than it probably was. Tomorrow we'll explore properly, figure out what needs fixing first. Tonight, we sleep warm and grateful for walls that kept standing when they had every reason to fall. She lay awake long after Daniel slept, listening to sounds that cities never made. Wind moving through grass, animals she couldn't identify, the house itself settling and shifting with its own rhythms. Above, stars wheeled across sky unpolluted by artificial light, brilliant and indifferent, observing without offering judgment or assistance. Rachel thought about her grandmother, about Rosa Elena Mendoza, who'd lived here and loved someone and eventually left it all behind. What had she thought about during nights like this? Had she felt the same combination of determination and terror that Rachel felt now? Had she lain awake wondering if she'd made catastrophic mistake or necessary choice? The morning brought problems with the clarity of daylight, revealing what darkness had hidden. Water became immediate concern. No plumbing, no well, no obvious source. Rachel found a creek a quarter-mile from the house, flowing clear and cold, tested it with strips from a camping supply kit that showed acceptable quality. She filled containers, hauled them back, established routine that would need repeating multiple times daily. Sanitation presented complications she'd anticipated but not fully planned for. The root cellar could be adapted for waste storage, sealed containers, and lime, keeping smell manageable. Not elegant, not permanent, but functional until better solutions emerged. The structure's condition revealed itself through systematic examination. The foundation remained solid, stones fitted together without mortar but locked by gravity and centuries of compression. The walls showed cracks, but nothing suggesting imminent collapse. The roof needed extensive repair, but portions remained sound enough to keep upper floors dry. Windows throughout needed replacing, or at minimum covering with something better than rotting plywood. The door required raining and weather stripping. Gaps between stones needed sealing against winter wind. The list of repairs grew overwhelming, but Rachel forced herself to prioritize. Warmth first, water second, everything else as resources allowed. Daniel's presence transformed work from optional to mandatory. Every decision filtered through his needs: where he'd sleep, how she'd keep him warm, what she'd do if he got sick, how she'd continue providing the basic care that kept him healthy despite circumstances that made healthcare access complicated. She constructed a play area near the fireplace using blankets and pillows, a safe zone where Daniel could practice rolling and reaching while Rachel worked on repairs that couldn't wait. He watched with serious attention, tracking her movements, occasionally vocalizing sounds that might have been encouragement or protest, or simply acknowledgement of her presence. The first week passed in exhausting rhythm. Wake with dawn, feed Daniel, restart the fire that had banked overnight, haul water, prepare food using the camping stove, attempt one repair project while keeping him entertained and safe, collapse into sleep shortly after dark. No electricity meant no screens, no distraction, No escape from the relentless immediacy of survival. Rachel's body adapted with the reluctant efficiency of muscles remembering work they'd forgotten. Her hands developed calluses from handling tools and hauling wood. Her back ached from postures modern life had made unnecessary. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, burning calories that food couldn't fully replace. But Daniel thrived in ways that surprised her. The quiet seemed to calm him, removing the sensory overload that cities provided. His sleep improved, his feeding became more efficient, his engagement with his environment grew more focused. The developmental delays remained. He wouldn't sit unassisted for months yet, wouldn't crawl according to typical timelines. But his progress continued, adapted to circumstances rather than defeated by them. The property revealed itself slowly through daily exploration. Behind the house, terraced land suggested someone had gardened here once. The stone retaining walls remained intact. Soil beneath probably still fertile despite years of neglect. Rachel imagined spring planting, vegetables that would reduce grocery costs, and provide fresh food without requiring the trips to town that burn gas and time. She found remnants of outbuildings, a collapsed shed, the remains of what might have been a chicken coop, posts that suggested fencing had once divided land into purposeful sections. All of it abandoned, reclaimed by sage and grass and time's patient destruction. One morning, digging near the collapsed shed to salvage timber that might be useful, Rachel's shovel struck something solid and metallic. She cleared dirt carefully, revealing a metal box maybe 2 feet square, rusted but intact, sealed with a lock that had corroded past function. Her heart rate spiked with recognition of discovery, though she couldn't articulate why this felt significant beyond its unexpected presence. She hauled the box inside, set it near the fire where Daniel played, examined it with growing curiosity. The lock broke easily when struck with hammer, metal too degraded to resist force. The lid opened with resistance that spoke of decades sealed, releasing a smell of old paper and trapped air. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them better than exposure would have, lay documents. Deeds to the property, dated 1908. Marriage certificates. Birth records. Photographs capturing faces Rachel couldn't identify, but recognized somehow as family. Her grandmother as a young woman, stern-faced and beautiful. Others whose relationship she could only guess at, parents, siblings, friends who'd shared this land when it had been home rather than ruin. Beneath the documents, more carefully preserved, were letters. Dozens of them, tied with ribbon that had faded from whatever color it had been to uniform gray. Rachel opened the first with hands that trembled slightly, unfolding paper made brittle by age. The handwriting was elaborate, old-fashioned, difficult to parse. But the content emerged clearly enough through patient reading. My dearest Rosa, I write to you knowing this letter may never reach your hands, but compelled by necessity to speak truth that circumstances prevent voicing directly. The land you now occupy carries history that powerful interests wish to remain buried. Your grandfather discovered evidence of crimes that reach far beyond what any of us imagined possible. What you must understand is that the house itself, the stones, the structure, the very foundation, contains more than simple shelter. Below the root cellar lies a chamber that my father built during construction, hidden even from county inspectors who would have questioned its purpose. I cannot describe openly what waits there. Should this correspondence be intercepted, such knowledge would endanger both of us further. But know that if circumstances force you to leave, if pressure makes remaining untenable, what lies below offers resources for starting anew. Access requires moving the false wall at the cellar's north end. The mechanism is simple once identified. 3 stones placed in sequence that appears natural but operates with intention. Your grandfather taught me this in his final days, making me swear to preserve the secret until such time as necessity demanded its revelation. I hope desperately that you'll never need to know any of this, that you'll live peacefully in the home he built, raising your children in safety that his sacrifice was meant to secure. But should the worst occur, should powers that destroyed him turn their attention toward you, understand that he provided for such contingency. The chamber contains enough to rebuild elsewhere, to start again under circumstances that offer genuine safety rather than temporary refuge. Use it wisely. Use it only if you must. And understand that everything he did because he believed some truths mattered more than personal safety. With love and hope for futures we can't yet imagine. Elena. Rachel read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing nuances she'd missed initially. The date, 1925, placed it nearly a century earlier. The references to danger and hidden chambers and resources suggested melodrama, but the letter's tone conveyed earnest warning rather than theatrical invention. She looked at the root cellar entrance, the trap door she'd examined briefly when first exploring the structure. At the north end, a false wall, 3 stones that operated a mechanism. Daniel needed changing. She forced herself through the routine, feeding him, settling him for a nap near the fire, banking would so heat would hold while she investigated something that might be nothing or might change everything. The root cellar descended into darkness that her lantern barely penetrated. 12 feet down, maybe 8 feet square, walls lined with stone shelving that would have held preserved foods when people still lived here. The north wall looked identical to the others at first examination. Stones fitted together, no obvious seams suggesting hidden mechanisms. Rachel ran her hands across the surface, pressing gently, searching for movement or gaps that indicated something other than solid construction. Minutes passed. Her lantern flickered with battery drainage. Above, Daniel's contented sounds filtered down, anchoring her to present necessity even as she searched for past secrets. Then she found it. 3 stones arranged in a vertical line, slightly proud of the surrounding surface, barely noticeable unless you were specifically looking. She pressed them in sequence, top, middle, bottom, and heard a click that made her pulse spike. A section of wall swung inward, not dramatically, just enough to reveal darkness beyond. A chamber, as the letter had described. Rachel widened the opening, shined her lantern inside, and felt her breath catch completely. The chamber stretched maybe 10 feet deep, 8 wide, height sufficient for standing upright. And along the walls, on shelves built for this purpose, were items that gleamed even under weak lantern light. Gold, not just a few pieces. Hundreds of coins, neatly stacked. Bars of various sizes, organized by weight. Jewelry. Rings, necklaces, bracelets, arranged carefully on velvet that moths had damaged but not destroyed. Rachel stepped inside with the cautious movements of someone who feared disturbing reality itself. This couldn't be real. Couldn't be here. Couldn't be hers. But it was. The chamber existed. The gold waited. And underneath it all, wrapped in more oilcloth, were documents, mineral rights, mining claims, certificates of deposit from banks that might or might not still exist, evidence of wealth accumulated through methods Rachel could only guess at. She stood in that hidden space, lantern casting shadows that danced across walls that had kept this secret for a century, and felt the weight of inheritance shift from burden into something approaching salvation. Above, Daniel woke crying. The sound pulled her back from paralysis and emotion. She climbed out of the cellar, closed the false wall, emerged into the main room where her son needed her attention more than hidden gold needed cataloging. She fed him, changed him, held him while her mind raced through implications she couldn't fully process. Money, real, substantial, life-changing wealth, hidden by her great-grandfather, preserved by her grandmother, waiting through decades until the moment when Rachel's desperation brought her to ruins that contained more than she'd imagined possible. But questions came with the discovery. Where had it come from? Why had it been hidden? What dangers had the letter referenced? And most importantly, could she actually use it, or would claiming this inheritance bring exactly the attention that those long-dead relatives had feared? The afternoon sun began its descent toward evening as Rachel sat by the fire, Daniel playing beside her, her thoughts cycling through possibilities that felt simultaneously like rescue and potential disaster. Some inheritances weren't simple gifts. Some came with costs that wouldn't be apparent until they'd already been paid. But sitting in a cold stone ruin with a son who deserved better than poverty could provide, Rachel couldn't afford the luxury of refusing wealth because its origins remained unclear. Tomorrow she would examine the documents more carefully, would try to understand what her great-grandfather had done and why her grandmother had kept it hidden, would decide whether to use what she'd found or seal it back in a darkness where it had waited for a century. Tonight, she added wood to the fire, pulled Daniel close, and allowed herself to imagine futures that weren't defined entirely by survival. Futures where therapy and medical care and basic security weren't impossible dreams, but achievable realities. The gold waited below in its hidden chamber. The ruins stood around them, solid despite decades of neglect. And somewhere in the darkness of Montana evening, Rachel Torres held her son and felt something shift. Not hope exactly, but possibility. The recognition that inheritance came in forms that couldn't be predicted, but might, if managed carefully, transform disaster into something approaching salvation. The wind picked up outside, rattling boards over windows, testing walls that had weathered a century of such assaults. Inside, fire crackled with warmth that made their small space feel less like ruin and more like refuge. Daniel dozed against her shoulder, trusting completely, and Rachel allowed herself to believe that maybe, somehow, they would survive this, would transform what they'd been given into what they needed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight they were warm, fed, together, and standing in a place that had waited a very long time to reveal its deepest secrets. Rachel woke before dawn to Daniel's hungry cries, the fire reduced to embers that barely illuminated their makeshift nest of sleeping bags and blankets. She fed him by lantern light, while her mind returned immediately to the chamber below, to gold that represented solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable 24 hours earlier. But using it required understanding it. The letter had warned of dangers, of powerful interests, of secrets worth killing for. Her great-grandfather hadn't hidden wealth casually. He'd built a concealed chamber, taught the mechanism to trusted family, and died under circumstances the letter implied weren't natural. After settling Daniel back to sleep, Rachel descended into the root cellar with the documents she'd found. The false wall opened more easily now that she understood the mechanism, revealing the chamber that morning light couldn't reach. She brought her lantern close to the shelves, examining what she'd only glimpsed the previous evening. The gold coins bore dates ranging from the 1880s through 1920s. American eagles, double eagles, some foreign currency she couldn't immediately identify. The bars were stamped with the same marks and weights: 1 pound, 5 pounds, some larger specimens that must have weighed 20 pounds each. Conservative estimates suggested hundreds of thousands of dollars in gold alone, maybe more depending on current market prices. But the documents proved more revealing than the metal. Mining claims filed in 1895 for territory 60 miles north. Transfer deeds showing sales to companies whose names meant nothing to Rachel. Receipts for equipment, supplies, labor. And beneath it all, a leather journal whose pages documented something that made Rachel's blood run cold. Her great-grandfather's handwriting filled the journal with methodical precision, entries dated and organized, creating a record that read like evidence file rather than personal diary. March 15, 1922. Met with representatives from Consolidated Western Mining. They're offering $500 for full rights to the northern claims. Henderson laughed when I refused, said I don't understand how business works in this territory. Said people who don't cooperate tend to have accidents. I've documented this conversation in the presence of witnesses who may or may not be willing to testify, if needed. April 3, 1922. My equipment was sabotaged overnight. Drill assembly damage beyond repair, $2,000 loss. Sheriff says it's probably kids, but there were no tracks, no evidence of amateur destruction. This was professional work meant to send message. I'm documenting everything, but keeping public records minimal. If they're watching, better they think I'm discouraged rather than preparing for extended fight. May 12, 1922. Henderson returned with new offer, $2,000 plus promise of safety for my family. The threat was implicit but clear. accept payment and leave, or face consequences. I refused again, documented the exchange. Rosa doesn't understand why I won't take the money and move somewhere easier. How do I explain that accepting their terms means admitting that power trumps rights, that violence succeeds where law should prevail? The entries continued through 1923 and 1924, documenting escalating pressure. Equipment destroyed, claims jumped by companies using legal technicalities, threats delivered with increasing directness. Her great-grandfather had fought with documentation, with witnesses, with stubborn refusal to surrender what was legally his. The final entries, dated late 1924, revealed how he'd protected his family when fighting became untenable. November 8, 1924. I've sold the claims, not to Consolidated Western, but to 3 separate families who deserve opportunity more than I deserve martyrdom. The gold I've accumulated from years of extraction is now hidden where they can't seize it through legal manipulation. The chamber below the house took 6 months to construct in absolute secrecy. Rosa knows nothing. Elena knows only what she must access it if I'm killed. If I die under suspicious circumstances, this journal serves as evidence. The dates correlate with documented incidents that authorities dismissed as accidents or bad luck. Henderson's threats are recorded. The pattern is clear to anyone willing to look, but I'm not naive enough to think justice will be pursued vigorously for a stubborn homesteader who inconvenienced powerful interests. The gold is for Rosa and any children we might have. For starting fresh where Consolidated Western doesn't control local authorities. For buying safety, I can't provide through fighting. I'm not surrendering, I'm adapting. Choosing survival over principle isn't cowardice when your family's safety depends on pragmatic retreat. The journal ended there. No final entry explaining what happened next. But the letter Rachel had found from Elena, dated 1925, implied her great-grandfather's fears had been justified. He died. The circumstances had been suspicious enough to prompt Elena's warning to Rosa about hidden resources and dangerous knowledge. Rachel sat in that concealed chamber, surrounded by wealth accumulated through stubborn defiance of companies willing to murder for profit, and understood why her grandmother had never mentioned this place, had never returned after leaving, had perhaps hoped the gold would remain hidden forever rather than attract the same dangers that had killed her father. But a century had passed. Consolidated Western mining probably didn't exist anymore. The men who'd made threats were long dead. Whatever power structure had made fighting untenable in 1924 couldn't possibly still be relevant in 2024. Could it? Rachel gathered documents carefully, taking photographs with her phone despite the lack of signal for uploading. Evidence that might matter if questions arose about where money came from. She selected 3 gold coins, small enough to be discreet, valuable enough to solve immediate problems, and closed the chamber behind her. The drive to Portland took 90 minutes, Daniel secured in his car seat, the 3 gold coins hidden in a compartment beneath the spare tire. Rachel had researched gold dealers during her library days, finding 2 that had decent reviews and didn't advertise in ways that suggested they catered exclusively to criminals trying to launder assets. The first dealer, Mountain West Precious Metals, occupied a small office in a strip mall that smelled of Chinese takeout from the restaurant next door. The proprietor, a man in his 60s who introduced himself as Frank Delgado, examined the coins under magnification with the focused attention of someone who'd spent a lifetime evaluating authenticity. These are legitimate, probably late 1800s based on wear patterns and minting characteristics. Where did you acquire them? Rachel had practiced the explanation during the drive. Estate inheritance. My grandmother passed, and these were among her belongings. I need to convert them to cash for living expenses. Frank's expression suggested he'd heard similar stories countless times, some true, most partially fabricated. I can offer you spot price minus 10% for my margin. Current gold rate is $1,945 per ounce. These coins contain roughly 1 ounce each, so I'll give you $5,250 total for all 3. The amount hit Rachel with physical force. $5,250. More than she'd had at any point since the divorce. More than 3 months of her dental hygienist salary. 4 coins out of hundreds waiting in the hidden chamber. Done. Frank produced paperwork requiring identification and signatures. Documentation that probably created records Rachel would eventually need to explain on tax returns or financial disclosures. But immediate need outweighed theoretical future complications. He counted cash carefully, 50s and 20s stacked with the precision of someone who'd performed this transaction thousands of times. Rachel left the office with an envelope containing money that felt simultaneously like salvation and evidence of something she couldn't quite articulate. Relief, certainly, but also unease about wealth that came from ancestors who died fighting companies willing to murder for mineral rights. The property tax office occupied a government building downtown, where parking cost $3 per hour, and every transaction required documentation in triplicate. Rachel waited 40 minutes for her number to be called, Daniel growing fussy despite the bottle she'd brought. The clerk, a woman named Sandra whose expression suggested she'd stopped caring about customer service somewhere around her 3rd year of employment, pulled up the property records with practiced keystrokes. Tax debt is $12,847, including penalties and interest. Payment in full required to prevent foreclosure proceedings. Rachel counted cash across the counter. $12,847 in bills that drew attention from other clerks and customers. Sandra's expression shifted from bored to suspicious. This is a lot of cash. Estate inheritance. Gold coins I converted today. I have documentation from the dealer if you need it. The explanation satisfied procedural requirements, if not personal curiosity. Sandra processed the payment with efficiency that suggested she wanted Rachel gone before awkward questions arose about where someone who looked homeless had acquired nearly $13,000 in cash. The receipt felt more valuable than it should have. Proof of ownership. Legal standing that prevented the county from seizing property or continuing demolition proceedings. One problem solved through wealth that had waited a century for exactly this purpose. The drive back to the ruins felt lighter despite exhaustion and Daniel's increasing fussiness. She'd paid the taxes, had money remaining for immediate needs, could begin addressing repairs that would transform the structure from condemned to habitable. But as she turned onto the dirt road leading to the property, Rachel noticed something that made her pulse spike with recognition of wrongness. Tire tracks, fresh impressions in soft earth where no vehicles had been except hers. Someone had been here, recently, while she'd been in Portland claiming inheritance that apparently interested parties beyond herself. She parked cautiously, scanning for threats she couldn't specifically identify. Everything looked undisturbed. The door hung as she'd left it. No obvious signs of intrusion. But the tracks were unmistakable. A truck or SUV had driven to within 50 feet of the house, circled, then departed. Rachel grabbed Daniel and his supplies, moved inside quickly, secured the door with a deadbolt she'd installed 2 days earlier. The space looked exactly as she'd left it. Fire cold, but ready to restart. Their sleeping area undisturbed. Daniel's toys where they'd been. But someone had been here. Had known the property was occupied despite its isolation. Had perhaps been watching, waiting for her to leave, taking opportunity to investigate without confrontation. The thought of strangers examining their space while she'd been gone made Rachel's skin crawl with violation that felt worse than the actual homelessness had. This was supposed to be safe, remote enough that privacy was guaranteed, hidden enough that attention wouldn't find them. She checked the root cellar immediately, descending with Daniel on her hip and lantern in hand. The false wall remained closed, the mechanism undiscovered. Relief flooded through her with force that made her hands shake. Whatever had brought someone here, they hadn't found the chamber, hadn't discovered gold that would explain everything while creating new dangers. Evening brought decisions Rachel needed to make with clearer thinking than fear provided. The tire tracks could mean anything. Local curiosity about the condemned property now showing signs of occupation. County officials checking on repairs. Coincidence rather than threat. Or they could mean exactly what her great-grandfather's journal documented. attention from interests that viewed this land and its secrets as something worth monitoring. Companies or their descendants that had killed once and might kill again if they understood what remained hidden below stone ruins nobody was supposed to care about. Rachel fed Daniel while her mind worked through options. She could leave, take the gold, establish life somewhere else where history didn't create complications. Could sell the property after making minimal repairs, pocket whatever value it held beyond the gold she'd already claimed. Or she could stay, make repairs that established legitimacy, transform ruins into home while keeping secrets that protected the wealth hidden below. Bet that a century of distance meant old dangers had lost their relevance. The knock on the door came at 7 p.m., full dark, unexpected enough that Rachel jumped with instinctive fear before forcing herself calm. She secured Daniel in his safe play area, grabbed the knife she'd kept near the fire since finding the tire tracks, approached the door with caution that felt both paranoid and entirely justified. "Who is it, Miss Torres?" "My name is James Whitmore. I'm with Western Resources Development. I was hoping to speak with you about your property." The name hit like confirmation of fears Rachel had been trying to dismiss. Whitmore, too close to the companies her great-grandfather had fought to be coincidence. Too convenient appearing the same day she claimed inheritance and paid property taxes. She opened the door 6 inches, keeping the chain engaged, knife hidden behind her back. The man on the porch looked mid-50s, expensive jacket over casual clothes, expression arranged in friendly concern that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Torres, I apologize for the intrusion. I saw the smoke from your fire and wanted to make sure you understood this property is condemned. For your safety and your child's, I need to inform you that continued occupation violates county orders. I paid the property taxes today. The condemnation proceedings are paused pending inspection of repairs I'm making." Whitmore's smile never wavered. "I understand you have legal claim to the structure, but surely you recognize this isn't suitable housing for an infant. Western Resources has been interested in acquiring this land for development purposes. We'd be willing to offer fair market value, say $50,000 for the full parcel. That would give you resources to find proper housing elsewhere." Rachel studied him through the gap, reading calculation behind practice concern. He'd come prepared with an offer, had known she was here, had probably been the one leaving tire tracks while she'd been in Portland. "The property isn't for sale. Ms. Torres, be reasonable. This structure is over 100 years old, significantly damaged, lacks modern amenities. You have a child with special needs who requires access to medical care and services. $50,000 could provide real stability rather than this." He gestured at the ruins with dismissive sweep. "How do you know about my son's medical needs?" The question landed with weight. Whitmore tried to deflect. "I assumed given the visible signs. I'm not trying to intrude on your privacy, merely to help you understand the practical realities. My practical reality is that this is my home and it's not for sale. Please leave my property." Whitmore's expression shifted subtly, friendliness giving way to something harder. "Ms. Torres, Western Resources has been working on development projects in this region for decades. We faced obstacles before from property owners who didn't understand how things work here. Those situations were resolved, one way or another. I'm offering you a generous exit that protects your interests and your son's welfare. I'd strongly advise accepting." The threat was clear despite careful wording. Accept the offer or face consequences that had been resolved in ways that probably weren't pleasant for the property owners who'd resisted. "Get off my property. Now." He produced a business card, held it toward the gap in the door. "My offer remains available for 48 hours. After that, things become more complicated. I hope you'll make the choice that serves your son's best interests." Rachel slammed the door, engaged the deadbolt, stood listening to his footsteps retreat toward whatever vehicle he'd parked beyond her sight. Her hands shook with adrenaline and recognition that old dangers hadn't died with her great-grandfather. They'd merely evolved, passed through generations of companies that viewed land and resources as something to be acquired regardless of legal ownership or moral objection. She picked up Daniel, held him close, felt his solid warmth anchoring her to present necessity. They couldn't leave. Running meant abandoning gold that represented their only path to stability. Meant validating the lesson that power trumped rights, that threats succeeded where law should protect. Her great-grandfather had stayed until staying became untenable, had hidden his wealth, and told his family to use it only when circumstances demanded. Rachel stood in the house he'd built, holding the great-great-grandson he'd never met, and felt certainty settle beneath fear. She wouldn't be threatened into abandoning what was hers. Wouldn't teach her son that disability meant accepting whatever crumbs powerful people offered. Wouldn't validate a century-old pattern of companies murdering their way to profit. But she also wasn't naive. Whitmore had made threat clear. 48 hours until things got complicated. Rachel needed help, allies, resources beyond the gold hidden below stone floors. Her phone had signal near the eastern window. She pulled up the contact information Dr. Martinez had given her, the referral to home-based therapy programs that included social workers trained to navigate systems that failed families like hers. The woman who answered spoke with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis calls. Community Support Services, this is Margaret Chen. My name is Rachel Torres. Dr. Martinez gave me your number. Her voice caught unexpectedly. I'm in a situation where I need help understanding my rights regarding property ownership and threats from development companies. Margaret's tone shifted immediately. Are you safe right now? Is your son safe? Yes, we're okay. But I think we might not be if I don't figure out how to protect what we have. Give me your address and situation overview. I'll see what resources we can mobilize. Rachel explained quickly. The inheritance, the property taxes paid, Whitmore's visit and implicit threats, her suspicion that this connected to her great-grandfather's death a century earlier. The story sounded paranoid, voiced aloud, conspiracy theory rather than legitimate concern. But Margaret listened without skepticism. Development companies in rural areas have a long history of using intimidation tactics against property owners they can't buy cheaply. Your situation isn't unique, which means there are legal protections and advocacy organizations experienced in fighting this. Let me make some calls. Don't accept any offers, don't sign anything, and document every interaction. If Whitmore or anyone from Western Resources returns, record the conversation if possible. I don't have video capability without internet, and my phone's battery won't last for extended recording. Then write everything down immediately after. Dates, times, exact wording of threats. That documentation becomes evidence if this escalates legally. I'll get back to you within 24 hours with resources and next steps. Meanwhile, you're within your rights to refuse entry to anyone who isn't law enforcement with a warrant. Your property taxes are paid, which means you have legal standing the county must respect. After the call ended, Rachel felt marginally more grounded. Help existed, systems designed to protect against exactly what she was experiencing. But her great-grandfather had tried those systems, had documented everything, had sought legal recourse, had believed that evidence and proper channels would prevail against threats. He died anyway. Companies had waited him out, had applied pressure until fighting meant endangering his family more than surrendering did. Rosa had left, had never mentioned this place to her own children, had perhaps hoped that abandonment would finally end cycles of violence that persisted across generations. Rachel added wood to the fire, settled Daniel for sleep, lay awake in darkness planning defensive inheritance that represented more than property or wealth. It represented the principle that legal ownership meant something, that documents and deeds mattered more than corporate desires, that one woman with a disabled son could stand against interests that had been crushing resistance for over a century. The morning brought frost that outlined the boarded windows in crystalline patterns. Rachel woke to Daniel's movements against her side, his small body generating warmth that made their nest of blankets almost comfortable despite temperature that made breath visible. She needed to fortify their position while waiting for Margaret's promised resources. The door was secure, but windows remained vulnerable, boards that could be pried loose, glass that could be broken. She spent the morning reinforcing each opening with timber salvage from collapsed outbuildings, creating barriers that wouldn't stop determined intrusion but would delay it enough to allow response. The work felt simultaneously practical and paranoid. Was she defending against real danger or imagining threats that a century of distance had rendered obsolete? But Whitmore's visit had been real. His threats had been clear despite careful wording. Companies didn't send representatives to make offers on condemned properties unless they knew something about the land's value beyond what public records revealed. What did Western Resources understand about this property that Rachel was only beginning to piece together? The mining claims her great-grandfather had sold were 60 miles north, too distant to create ongoing interest in these specific ruins. The gold hidden below was secret that only family had known, and that family was reduced to Rachel and Daniel. So what made this land valuable enough to justify threats and pressure a century after the original conflicts? She returned to the documents from the hidden chamber, spreading them across the floor near the fire where light was best. Mining claims, yes, but also mineral rights deeds, water rights certificates, easement agreements. Her great-grandfather hadn't just owned this parcel. He controlled access to resources that modern development might require. One document in particular caught her attention. An easement agreement dated 1920 granting limited access across his property for a water pipeline serving the growing settlement that would eventually become the nearest town. The language specified that access could be revoked if compensation wasn't maintained according to terms that indexed to inflation and resource usage. Rachel pulled out her phone, searched for the town's current water infrastructure, found news articles about expansion projects, plans for new development that required securing water rights through territories that included. She zoomed in on the maps, the exact corridor where her great-grandfather's easement had been granted. Western Resources Development wasn't interested in the house or even the land itself. They needed access the easement controlled, access that Rachel had inherited along with ruins and hidden gold, access that was probably worth millions to development projects that couldn't proceed without it. And if Rachel wouldn't sell cheaply, Western Resources faced having to pay actual market value for something they'd assumed would be abandoned, condemned, acquired through tax foreclosure without legitimate heir involvement. She disrupted their plans by existing, by claiming inheritance, by paying the taxes that should have delivered the property into their hands through bureaucratic process rather than negotiation. The realization settled over Rachel with weight that felt like recognition and dread combined. This was bigger than one woman's claim to family property. This was leverage in development projects worth millions. This was exactly the situation that had gotten her great-grandfather killed when Consolidated Western Mining had faced similar obstacles to their expansion plans. History wasn't repeating. It was continuing, the same pattern with different company names and modern legal frameworks that made murder slightly less convenient than it had been in 1924. Margaret Chen called back that evening, her voice carrying urgency that suggested she'd discovered similar conclusions through her own research. Rachel, you need legal representation immediately. I've contacted the Montana Legal Services Association. They provide pro bono help to low-income residents facing property rights violations. An attorney named David Brennan is willing to take your case. He's experienced with development company intimidation tactics and has successfully defended property owners against predatory acquisition attempts. Brennan, the name connected to the law firm that had contacted her about the inheritance. Is he related to Thomas Brennan? His grandson. Thomas handled estate law. David focuses on property rights and corporate accountability. He'll call you within the hour to discuss strategy. Meanwhile, I've also contacted a nonprofit called Rural Property Defense Coalition. They document cases like yours and provide advocacy support. Expect a call from them tomorrow. Margaret, I think Western Resources needs an easement my great-grandfather controlled. Water rights for development projects. That's why they're pressuring me. Silence stretched while Margaret processed implications. That changes everything. Easement rights can be worth millions if development can't proceed without them. You're not just a property owner they want to intimidate. You're an obstacle to projects they've probably already committed millions of dollars to planning. Rachel, you need to be very careful. Companies don't walk away from that kind of investment easily. My great-grandfather died fighting companies like this. I know. David Brennan knows, too. His grandfather's death is part of why David does this work. He'll help you navigate this, but understand you're in real danger. Development companies have gotten more sophisticated since 1924, but they're not less willing to remove obstacles that threaten major profits. After the call ended, Rachel held Daniel close, feeling his heartbeat against her chest, his complete trust that she would protect him regardless of threats that were beginning to crystallize into genuine danger rather than paranoid imagination. David Brennan's call came 30 minutes later. His voice carried authority tempered by something that might have been personal investment. Ms. Torres, Margaret Chen briefed me on your situation. Before we proceed, I need to ask, do you have documentation of Whitmore's visit and threats? Written notes. Immediate after he left. Dates, times, exact wording I could remember. Good. That's admissible evidence if this goes to court. I'm going to file for a restraining order preventing Western Resources from contacting you or approaching your property, pending resolution of the easement rights question. I'm also going to request immediate county investigation into whether their condemnation proceedings were initiated at Western Resources' request rather than legitimate safety concerns. Can they do that? Use county government to create condemnation orders that benefit their acquisition plans. David's laugh held no humor. They've been doing exactly that for over a century. It's not technically illegal if they can claim legitimate safety concerns existed independently of their interest. But the timing of your inheritance notice, their immediate visit, and the condemnation proceedings all happening within weeks creates pattern that suggests coordination. If I can prove the county colluded with Western Resources to manufacture grounds for seizing your property, we have a case for civil rights violations and fraud. What do I do if they come back before the restraining order is processed? Document everything. Don't engage beyond stating that you've retained legal counsel and all communication must go through me. If they become physically threatening, call 911 immediately. The county sheriff might be compromised if Western Resources has the connections I suspect, but creating official record of threats establishes evidence trail we can use federally if local authorities won't act. My great-grandfather documented everything. He died anyway. I know. David's voice softened. My grandfather handled your great-grandfather's estate settlement in 1925. He was the one who corresponded with your grandmother Elena about the hidden chamber and the gold your great-grandfather wanted protected. He knew the family had been threatened, suspected the death wasn't accidental, but couldn't prove murder and the authorities wouldn't investigate thoroughly. That failure haunted him the rest of his life. When Margaret contacted me about your situation, I realized this was the same family, the same property, probably the same pattern of corporate intimidation. I won't let history repeat if I can prevent it. Rachel felt something loosen in her chest. An ally who understood context beyond immediate legal questions. Someone who recognized that this was continuation of fight that had killed his grandfather's client and shaped his family's understanding of how power operated in territories where wealth concentrated in law enforcement served interests other than justice. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We're going up against a company with significant resources and probably generations of experience suppressing property owners who inconvenience their plans. This will get ugly before it gets resolved. But you have rights, documentation, and legal standing they can't simply dismiss. We make them fight for every inch. We make it expensive and public enough that buying you out becomes cheaper than continuing intimidation. That's how David beats Goliath in 2024. The next 48 hours passed in tense waiting. Rachel fortified the property further, created emergency supplies near multiple exits, practiced evacuation routes with Daniel in case rapid departure became necessary. She documented everything: the tire tracks, Whitmore's visit, every unusual sound or movement that might indicate surveillance. David's restraining order was filed and served within 36 hours. Western Resources Development responded through attorneys who claimed Whitmore's visit had been a good-faith attempt to help a struggling single mother understand her options. The threats Rachel described were characterized as misunderstandings and overinterpretation of genuine concern. But the legal filing created official record. acknowledged that contact had occurred, that offers had been made, that Rachel had refused and retained counsel. The pattern was established in court documents that couldn't be easily dismissed. Margaret's promised contact from the Rural Property Defense Coalition came through a woman named Sarah Martinez, who spoke with the passion of someone who'd been fighting corporate land grabs for decades. Ms. Torres, your case fits a pattern we've been documenting across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Development companies identify properties with strategic value, water rights, mineral access, easements, and use a combination of legal pressure and extra-legal intimidation to acquire them below market value. Property owners who resist face escalating threats until accepting buyouts seems preferable to continued harassment. Has anyone successfully fought back? Yes, but it requires resources most property owners don't have. Legal representation, media attention, documentation that creates public record. You started correctly by retaining David Brennan and contacting us. We're going to publicize your case through our network, creating pressure that makes continued intimidation costly for Western resources. Companies hate publicity about their tactics. They prefer operating quietly, settling with owners who don't have the knowledge or resources to fight effectively. What if they escalate before publicity creates enough pressure to make them back off? Sarah's pause suggested she'd faced this question before and didn't have reassuring answers. Then you need to decide whether property rights are worth risking your safety and your son's welfare. I can't make that choice for you. What I can tell you is that every property owner who stands up to these companies makes it marginally harder for them to continue these tactics. Your great-grandfather's documentation of consolidated Westerns practices helped establish legal precedents that limited some of their worst behaviors. Your resistance now might protect future property owners from facing what you're experiencing. But that's cold comfort if you're the one facing immediate danger. Rachel looked at Daniel, playing contentedly near the fire, unaware that his mother was deciding whether principles mattered enough to risk everything. Her great-grandfather had made similar calculations, had chosen fighting over surrendering until the cost to his family became untenable. Then he'd hidden the gold and told Elena to use it only if necessary. Was this necessary? Or was Rachel's stubbornness prioritizing pride over Daniel's safety? But running meant teaching her son that disability made them perpetual refugees, that legal rights meant nothing against power, that inheritance and ownership were privileges revocable whenever convenient for wealthier interests. What lesson did she want him to learn about how the world worked and how to navigate it when power seemed insurmountable? I'm staying, Rachel said. We fight. Then we'll fight with you, Sarah replied. Expect media contact within 48 hours. Local news first, then regional coverage if the story gains traction. We've got documentation from your great-grandfather's era that creates powerful historical context. One family fighting the same company's tactics across a century makes for compelling narrative that audiences respond to. The media attention materialized faster than promised. A local reporter named Jennifer Cole contacted Rachel within 24 hours, having received information from the Rural Property Defense Coalition about property rights conflicts in the region. She arrived with a camera operator, professional equipment, and questions that suggested genuine journalism rather than simple sensationalism. Rachel told her story while Daniel played nearby, providing visual context that made the situation immediate rather than abstract. Single mother with disabled infant living in condemned ruins while development company pressured her to sell easement rights worth millions for $50,000. Historical documentation showing her great-grandfather had faced identical tactics and died under suspicious circumstances. Legal representation confirming pattern of intimidation that spanned generations. Jennifer's questions pushed for details that created narrative arc. Why not take the buyout and find safer housing for your son? Because accepting teaches him that rights are negotiable when power pushes. Because the company that killed my great-grandfather shouldn't profit from a century of intimidation. Because if I surrender, the next property owner faces the same threats with the same expectation that resistance is futile. The segment aired 3 days later on local evening news, 6 minutes that transformed Rachel's isolation into public narrative. The response was immediate and divided. Supporters contacted David's office offering donations to the legal defense fund the Rural Property Defense Coalition had established. Critics questioned Rachel's fitness as a mother, suggesting that keeping Daniel in condemned ruins constituted child endangerment regardless of property rights. But the publicity created exactly the pressure Sarah had promised. Western Resources Development issued a statement through their PR firm characterizing Rachel as mentally unstable and claiming their concern was solely for her son's welfare. The defensive response suggested they were feeling heat from attention they preferred to avoid. David used the coverage to file additional motions, demanding county records of communications between Western Resources and officials who'd initiated condemnation proceedings, requesting investigation into whether the company had used improper influence to manufacture grounds for property seizure, pushing for expedited hearing on easement rights valuation that would establish what Western Resources actually owed if they wanted access. The legal strategy was working, making the fight expensive and public enough that settling seemed preferable to continued conflict. But Rachel recognized the risk that Sarah had warned about. Companies with significant investments didn't always respond to pressure with reasonable compromise. Sometimes they escalated. The escalation came on a Friday evening 2 weeks after Jennifer's segment aired. Rachel was preparing dinner using the camping stove, Daniel secured in his play area, when she heard vehicles approaching. Multiple engines, moving fast, not the cautious approach of someone making social visit. She grabbed Daniel and moved to the window, peering through gaps in the boards she'd reinforced. 3 trucks pulling up in coordinated formation, maybe 6 men emerging, all wearing work clothes and carrying tools that could serve as weapons. Not Whitmore this time. Hired contractors or enforcers, people whose presence communicated threat more effectively than another representative in expensive jacket making polite offers. Rachel's phone was in her hand immediately, calling 911 while watching the men fan out around the property. 911, what's your emergency? 6 men just arrived at my property uninvited. I have a restraining order against Western Resources Development prohibiting contact. I think they're about to force entry. Deputies are 40 minutes away, ma'am. Are you in immediate danger? 40 minutes. More than enough time for whatever these men intended to accomplish. Rachel heard the door being tested, boots on the porch, voices conferring about the best approach. Yes, I'm in danger. I have an infant with me. They're attempting to break in. Stay on the line, ma'am. Don't engage them directly. Lock yourself in the most secure room available. The root cellar. Rachel moved fast, grabbing supplies she'd staged for exactly this scenario, descending into darkness with Daniel clutched against her chest and the false wall mechanism memorized well enough to operate without light. Behind her, the door crashed open. Men's voices filled the main room, searching, calling out to each other about locations to check. They were looking for her specifically, not just vandalizing randomly. She reached the false wall, pressed the 3 stones in sequence, slipped into the hidden chamber, and closed the mechanism behind her. The darkness felt absolute, pressing against her like physical weight. Daniel whimpered, sensing her fear, and she held him close while covering his mouth gently to muffle sounds that might give away their position. The men's footsteps thundered on the floor above. Furniture being overturned, glass breaking, voices growing frustrated as they failed to locate her. One set of boots descended into the root cellar, flashlight beam sweeping across walls that looked solid and unbroken if you didn't know what to search for. Rachel held her breath, held Daniel with trembling hands, and waited in darkness beside gold that her great-grandfather had hidden from men exactly like these. History repeating with technological refinements, but fundamental tactics unchanged. Intimidation, violence, the assumption that might made right when legal channels moved too slowly to protect targets. The man in the root cellar kicked at the walls, testing for hollow sounds, finding none. The stones fit too tightly, the mechanism too well concealed. After minutes that felt infinite, he climbed back up, reported to the others that she must have fled before they arrived. Their voices debated next steps. Some wanted to wait, to catch her when she returned. Others argued that the police response was already in motion, that staying created risk of arrest that would complicate Western Resources' ability to claim innocence. Eventually, they agreed to deliver the message through destruction, ransacking the space thoroughly enough that Rachel would understand the cost of continued resistance. The sounds of systematic vandalism filtered down to the hidden chamber. Furniture broken, supplies destroyed, walls marked with paint or tools she couldn't see but could imagine. They were transforming her home in a crime scene, making the statement that property rights meant nothing against power willing to commit violence. After 30 minutes, the trucks departed, engines fading into distance, silence returning like aftermath of explosion. Rachel waited, counting seconds, making herself remain hidden until absolutely certain they'd gone and weren't watching from distance to see if she'd return. Daniel had fallen asleep against her shoulder, exhausted by fear and darkness, trusting her completely to keep him safe. Rachel sat in that chamber, surrounded by gold that hadn't protected her great-grandfather and couldn't protect her, and felt something shift. Not defeat, something harder. Rage. Pure, clarifying fury at men who thought violence was acceptable response to legal resistance. At companies that had been doing this for over a century and expected to continue indefinitely. At systems that made protecting your child from homelessness require defending yourself from corporate mercenaries in ruins your grandmother had kept waiting across decades. She emerged only when phones showed 45 minutes had passed. Deputies would have arrived by now if they'd actually come. Rachel climbed out of the root cellar into devastation that exceeded her worst expectations. The main room was destroyed, sleeping bags slashed, supplies scattered and damaged, walls marked with spray paint that read, "Leave while you can," in letters a foot high. Daniel's toys broken and scattered. The systematic thoroughness of it suggested professionals executing instructions rather than random vandals expressing rage. Rachel stood in the wreckage holding her son and felt the full weight of what her great-grandfather must have experienced. The helplessness of watching everything you'd built being destroyed. The recognition that legal rights meant nothing without power to enforce them. The terrible calculus of whether continuing to fight served principles or endangered family beyond what justice was worth. Her phone rang. David Brennan's number. "Rachel, I just got notification from dispatch. Are you all right? Is Daniel safe? We're alive. The house is destroyed. They came looking for us, specifically. I hid in the chamber with the gold until they left. David, they're not backing down because of publicity or legal pressure. They're escalating exactly like they did with my great-grandfather." Silence stretched while David processed the information. When he spoke again, his voice carried weight Rachel hadn't heard before. "I'm contacting the FBI. This crosses the line from civil dispute to federal crimes, intimidation, terrorism, possibly attempted kidnapping, given that we're actively searching for you. And I'm going to recommend you accept protective custody until we can establish that you're genuinely safe. This isn't about property rights anymore. This is about your life and Daniel's welfare." Rachel looked around at destruction that had been home hours earlier, at the message painted across walls that had sheltered her grandmother and great-grandmother before her, at inheritance that had become battlefield where old wars continued under new management. "No, I'm not leaving. They want me scared enough to run. That's exactly what my great-grandfather did, left when threats made staying too dangerous for his family. And it didn't solve anything. Just delayed the fight for a century until someone else stood in the same place, facing the same choice. If I run, Western Resources gets the easement, gets to continue these tactics, gets to win through violence what they couldn't win through law. And Daniel learns that disability means accepting refuge wherever power allows us to exist. I won't teach him that lesson. Rachel, they nearly caught you. Next time you might not have warning, might not reach the hidden chamber. They could hurt Daniel to pressure you into surrendering the property. Then you make sure the FBI moves faster than Western Resources does. Make sure the media coverage intensifies. Make sure every step they take creates bigger problems than killing one stubborn woman and her disabled son could solve. That's how David beats Goliath now. Not by hiding, but by making violence more expensive than negotiation. David's sigh carried frustration and admiration combined. I'll file federal charges tomorrow morning. I'll contact every media outlet in 3 states. I'll make sure your story goes national if necessary. But Rachel, promise me that if they come back, if you're in actual danger, you'll prioritize Daniel's safety over property rights. Some hills aren't worth dying on. Rachel looked at her son, sleeping peacefully despite destruction surrounding them, trusting her to make choices that serve his interests. This isn't about hills or property. This is about teaching him that rights mean something, that ownership matters, that one person with truth can stand against power. If I run, he grows up believing disability makes us perpetual victims subject to whatever accommodation wealth provides. If I stay and fight, he learns that stubbornness and legal rights and refusal to surrender can matter more than resources or connections. That's the inheritance I want him to have. After the call ended, Rachel began salvaging what she could from the wreckage. Some supplies were still usable. The camping stove survived. Daniel's clothes needed washing but weren't destroyed. The fire could be rebuilt. The space could be cleaned. And below, in a hidden chamber, gold waited that could fund legal battles Western resources wasn't prepared for. Could pay for security systems and documentation and expert witnesses and every tool modern law provided for defending rights that companies assumed only they possessed resources to enforce. Her great-grandfather had hidden wealth for exactly this purpose, had understood that fighting required resources beyond moral authority, had told Elena to use the gold when circumstances demanded, when survival required spending what had been protected. Rachel stood in ruins that had survived a century, holding a son who deserved to learn that disability didn't mean defeat and felt certainty settle. They would fight, would use every coin her great-grandfather had hidden, would make Western resources victory so expensive and public that intimidation tactics became liability rather than asset. The war was continuing. The inheritance had been claimed. And this time, the outcome would be different. Outside, Montana darkness pressed against damaged walls that still stood despite men's best efforts. Inside, mother and child prepared for battles that lay ahead, protected by gold and legal rights, and stubborn refusal to surrender what was theirs. The fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. The FBI agents arrived at dawn, 3 vehicles pulling up in formation that mirrored the previous night's attack, but with federal authority replacing mercenary intimidation. Special Agent Victoria Reyes introduced herself with efficiency that suggested she'd handled corporate violence cases before and understood the dynamics at play. Ms. Torres, we need to document everything. The break-in, the threats, the historical pattern connecting current events to your great-grandfather's death. This goes beyond simple property dispute when you add attempted assault and witness intimidation to a century of similar tactics. Rachel walked them through the destruction, showed them the spray-painted threats, explained how she'd hidden in the root cellar with Daniel while men searched for them specifically. Agent Reyes photographed everything with methodical precision, collecting evidence that transformed vandalism into federal crime scene. The restraining order violation alone gives us grounds for arrests once we identify the individuals involved. But I want to understand the bigger picture. Your attorney mentioned historical documentation connecting Western resources to similar incidents dating back to the 1920s. Rachel retrieved her great-grandfather's journal from the hidden chamber, careful not to reveal the gold or the mechanism that protected it. The leather-bound book landed on a makeshift table with weight that represented more than physical pages. It carried a century of resistance, documentation that had waited for exactly this moment. Agent Reyes read in silence, her expression hardening with each entry. When she finished, she looked at Rachel with something approaching respect. This is extraordinary evidence. Your great-grandfather created documentation that meets modern evidentiary standards despite being written 100 years ago. Dates witnesses specific threats, pattern of escalation. Combined with your current situation, this establishes that Western Resources, or its predecessor companies, has been using intimidation tactics for at least a century to acquire property rights. Can you prosecute them for what happened to my great-grandfather? Statute of limitations prevents murder charges for crimes that old, but we can use the historical pattern to establish ongoing criminal enterprise. If we can prove organizational continuity between consolidated Western mining and current Western resources development, we demonstrate that these aren't isolated incidents but systematic tactics spanning generations. That transforms individual crimes into RICO violations, racketeer, influenced, and corrupt. Organizations Act. We're talking about potential charges that could dismantle the entire corporate structure. The implications settled over Rachel with force that made her hands tremble. Not just protecting her property, but potentially exposing and ending tactics that had destroyed families for over a century. Her great-grandfather's documentation becoming foundation for prosecution he'd never lived to see. What do you need from me? Everything. Every document your great-grandfather left. Every communication with Whitmore and Western Resources. Your testimony about the attack. Permission to install surveillance equipment that will capture any future contact attempts. And most importantly, your willingness to testify publicly when this goes to trial. Companies like Western Resources rely on victims being too intimidated or exhausted to maintain resistance. We need you committed for the long term. Rachel looked at Daniel, awake now and watching the agents with the solemn attention of infants who sense important things happening around them. My son deserves to grow up understanding that rights mean something. That disability doesn't make us subject to whatever accommodation power provides. I'll testify. I'll do whatever's necessary. Agent Reyes nodded. Then we move forward. Fair warning, this gets worse before it gets better. Western Resources will realize federal investigation is active. They'll lawyer up, claim everything was misunderstanding or actions by rogue contractors they'll disavow. They'll try to settle, make this go away quietly. The pressure on you to accept will be intense. My great-grandfather didn't accept. Neither will I. The surveillance equipment went up that afternoon. Cameras covering every approach. Motion sensors creating perimeter detection. Audio recording devices that would capture any future contact. The property transformed into monitored zone where Western Resources couldn't operate without creating federal evidence. But Agent Reyes had been right about pressure intensifying. David called that evening with news that Western Resources attorneys had reached out with revised offer, $500,000 for the easement rights, legal recognition of Rachel's ownership of the remaining property, and agreement to fund complete restoration of the house to modern habitability standards. That's $500,000, Rachel, plus maybe another $100,000 in restoration work. You'd have genuine home for Daniel, resources for his medical care and therapy, security beyond what the gold provides. And they're offering it specifically because federal investigation makes continued intimidation more expensive than settlement. The amount should have been tempting. Would solve every practical problem Rachel faced. But accepting meant teaching Daniel that violence succeeded when threats were calibrated correctly, that rights are negotiable when power pushed hard enough, that his mother's principles lasted only until the price got high enough. No. We proceed with prosecution. Make them face consequences instead of buying their way out. David's sigh carried frustration and admiration. You understand this means years of legal battles? Testimony, depositions, media scrutiny, Western Resources using every resource to discredit you? They'll question your fitness as mother, suggest Daniel will be better off in care where he'd receive proper services. They'll make your life hell. They already made my life hell. Now we make them pay for it. The media coverage exploded beyond local news into regional and then national attention. Jennifer Cole's follow-up segment about the FBI investigation attracted interest from larger outlets. Within a week, Rachel found herself being interviewed by reporters from Portland's major newspapers, regional television stations, and eventually a producer from a national news magazine interested in the human interest angle. single mother with disabled son fighting century-old corporate intimidation tactics. The producer, a woman named Alexandra Stern, approached the story with the kind of thorough research that created compelling narrative rather than simple sensationalism. She'd obtained copies of Rachel's great-grandfather's journal through FBI disclosure, had researched consolidated Western mining's history and its evolution into Western resources development, had documented at least 6 other property owners who'd faced similar pressure over the past 2 decades. This isn't about one woman's property dispute, Alexandra explained during their pre-interview. This is about systematic tactics that companies use to acquire valuable rights from owners who lack resources to fight back. Your great-grandfather's documentation provides historical context that makes current practices look like continuation of long-term criminal enterprise rather than isolated business decisions. The interview happened at the property, cameras capturing the stone ruins that had survived century while framing Rachel's determination against backdrop of inheritance she was refusing to surrender. Daniel appeared throughout, his presence providing visual reminder of why this mattered beyond abstract principles about property rights. Alexandra's questions pushed for emotional vulnerability Rachel wasn't entirely comfortable providing. What keeps you going when accepting settlement would solve immediate problems and provide security for your son? Rachel chose words carefully, aware that millions might eventually hear them. My great-grandfather built this house with his own hands. He fought companies that thought violence was acceptable business tactic. He died protecting land and principles he believed mattered more than personal safety. I inherited more than property. I inherited obligation to finish fight he couldn't complete. And I inherited responsibility to teach my son that disability doesn't mean accepting whatever accommodation power offers. If I surrender because threats succeed, Daniel learns that rights are negotiable, that legal ownership means nothing against wealth, that being different makes you perpetual refugee subject to whatever terms stronger parties dictate. I won't teach him those lessons. The segment aired 3 weeks later during prime time, 18 minutes that transformed Rachel's local dispute into national conversation about corporate power and property rights. The response overwhelmed David's office. Donations to the Legal Defense Fund, offers of pro bono, support from law firms across the country, messages from other property owners who'd faced similar intimidation and now saw possibility of resistance. But the coverage also intensified exactly the pressure Agent Reyes had warned about. Western Resources issued statements through their PR firm characterizing Rachel as unstable opportunist exploiting her son's disability for sympathy while making baseless accusations against respected company. They produced documentation showing routine business practices, claimed the contractors who'd vandalized the property were unauthorized individuals who'd been immediately terminated, positioned themselves as victims of false allegations that damaged their reputation. The counter-narrative gained traction in conservative media outlets that framed Rachel as example of government overreach and frivolous litigation threatening business development. Opinion pieces questioned her fitness as mother, suggested Child Protective Services should investigate whether Daniel was receiving appropriate care in condemned building without modern utilities. David had anticipated this response. They're trying to make you the villain instead of the victim. Standard corporate defense strategy, shift focus to target's credibility rather than defending actions. We counter with continued documentation and witness testimony that corroborates your account. The witnesses emerged from unlikely sources. 3 former Western Resources employees contacted David's office independently, each describing company practices that matched Rachel's allegations. One had been present during internal meetings where executives discussed strategies for pressuring property owners into selling below market value. Another had documentation of payments to local officials who'd initiated condemnation proceedings on properties Western Resources wanted to acquire. The third had recordings of conversations where company leadership discussed making examples of owners who resisted too effectively. Their testimony transformed Rachel's narrative from isolated incident into systematic pattern. Agent Reyes used the evidence to expand the federal investigation, obtaining warrants for Western Resources corporate records, subpoenaing communications between executives and the contractors who'd attacked Rachel's property. The company's response suggested they were feeling genuine pressure for the first time. Their revised settlement offer jumped to $2 million plus full restoration and legal agreement never to pursue easement access. David presented the terms with professional neutrality that didn't disguise his opinion that acceptance made practical sense. $2 million, Rachel. That's generational wealth for your family. Daniel would have every therapy, every service, every opportunity. You'd never worry about money again, and you'd still own the property free and clear. Rachel sat in the house that her great-grandfather had built and her grandmother had preserved, holding Daniel while he practiced reaching for toys arranged within his developmental capacity. The money would solve everything practical, would provide security she'd never known and Daniel deserved. But her great-grandfather had possessed wealth too, gold he'd accumulated and hidden rather than using to buy safety. He'd understood that some principles couldn't be purchased, that surrendering when threats intensified taught lessons more valuable than immediate comfort. What happens to the other property owners Western Resources is pressuring. What happens to the next family that inherits land this company wants? If I accept settlement, I validate the tactic. I prove that enough money makes violence profitable. They'll do this again, and the next person won't have FBI investigation or media coverage or resources to fight back. No, we proceed with prosecution. The federal trial began 8 months after Rachel first claimed her inheritance, taking place in Portland's federal courthouse with media coverage that attracted protesters and supporters in equal measure. Western Resources Development faced RICO charges, conspiracy, witness intimidation, fraud, and multiple counts related to the attack on Rachel's property. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney James Morrison with Agent Reyes providing investigative support, built their case methodically. They started with Rachel's great-grandfather's journal, establishing a historical pattern that continued through decades. Former employees testified about company practices. The property owners who'd faced similar pressure explained tactics that matched Rachel's experience precisely. Rachel's testimony came on the trial's 4th day. She took the stand wearing clothing donated by supporters, holding composure despite exhaustion from months of preparation and stress that had aged her visibly. Daniel sat with Margaret Chen in the gallery, his presence reminding everyone what was actually at stake beyond legal abstractions. Morrison's questions guided her through chronology, the inheritance, the condemnation proceedings, Whitmore's threats, the attack that had forced her to hide in the root cellar with her infant son. Rachel answered clearly, providing details without embellishment, letting facts speak through simple description. The defense attorney's cross-examination attempted to paint her as opportunist who'd manufactured crisis for sympathy and profit. Ms. Torres, isn't it true that you were homeless and desperate when you received notice of this inheritance? Yes. And isn't it true that accepting Western Resources' initial offer of $50,000 would have solved your immediate problems? It would have provided temporary money. It wouldn't have solved the problem of companies using violence to take what doesn't belong to them. But you're not an expert in property law or corporate practices. How can you claim to understand what Western Resources' intentions were? Rachel met his gaze directly. I understand what 6 men searching my house while I hid with my 3-month-old baby means. I understand what spray paint saying leave while you can means. I don't need legal expertise to recognize threats. The attorney shifted tactics. Your son has Down syndrome, correct? And requires specialized medical care that you've struggled to provide. David objected immediately. Relevance, Your Honor. Daniel's medical needs have no bearing on whether Western Resources violated federal law. But the judge allowed the question, and Rachel answered with voice that didn't waver. My son has Down syndrome. He requires therapy and medical monitoring. Those needs don't make me incompetent to recognize corporate intimidation or make legal decisions about property I own. Wouldn't accepting settlement have provided resources for better care than living in condemned building without electricity or running water? Better care means care provided in home we own, where rights are respected, where my son learns that disability doesn't make us subject to whatever terms powerful interests dictate. Living in ruins while fighting for principles teaches him more valuable lessons than money could provide. The exchange created exactly the contrast Morrison wanted. Rachel as principled mother defending both property and dignity. Western Resources as corporation willing to exploit her son's disability to justify intimidation tactics. The jury's expressions suggested the message had landed effectively. The defense called its witnesses, Western Resources executives who claimed ignorance of contractor actions, local officials who insisted condemnation proceedings had been initiated independently, character witnesses who testified about the company's community investments and philanthropic activities. But Morrison's cross-examination systematically dismantled each claim, using documentation from whistleblowers and FBI investigation to demonstrate knowledge and coordination that contradicted protestations of innocence. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict came down on all major counts: guilty of RICO violations, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of witness intimidation, guilty of fraud in connection with condemnation proceedings. The judge's sentencing hearing happened 2 weeks later. She addressed Western Resources leadership with severity that suggested personal outrage at tactics they'd employed. This court has heard evidence of systematic intimidation spanning over a century, evidence of violence used as business tool, evidence of corruption reaching in a local government. The jury's verdict reflects community judgment that such practices will not be tolerated regardless of corporate resources or historical precedent. Western Resources Development faced $50 million in criminal fines, forfeiture of properties acquired through fraudulent means, and mandatory restructuring under federal oversight. Individual executives received prison sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years. The company's stock price collapsed. Their development projects stalled as investors fled association with convicted criminal enterprise. David called Rachel with the news, his voice carrying satisfaction that went beyond professional achievement. "We won. Not just your case, the entire pattern of corporate intimidation. Western Resources will likely file bankruptcy within 6 months. Their tactics are now criminal precedent that will make other companies think twice before using violence to acquire property rights." Rachel sat in the house that had been center of this fight, holding Daniel, who was now 10 months old and beginning to show signs of sitting independently. The victory should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt exhausted relief that the immediate battle had ended even as larger work remained. What happens to the easement now? It remains under your control. Any future development requiring access will need to negotiate fair market value, which independent appraisers estimate around $4 million based on the scope of projects that depend on it. You can sell those rights, lease them, or simply maintain control, knowing you've established legal precedent about their value. For $1 million, far more than Western Resources had offered, validation that her great-grandfather's fight had been about genuine value rather than stubborn principle alone. But the money felt less significant than what the verdict represented. Confirmation that rights mattered, that documentation and legal systems could function when pushed correctly, that one person's resistance could matter against institutional power. The months following the verdict brought transformation beyond legal victory. The media coverage had generated donations that exceeded legal defense costs by substantial margin. David worked with Margaret and the Rural Property Defense Coalition to establish the Torres-Mendoza Property Rights Foundation, using excess funds to provide legal support for other property owners facing corporate intimidation. Rachel became the foundation's public face despite personal discomfort with attention. She traveled to speak at community meetings, testified before state legislatures considering property rights protections, shared platforms with advocates who've been fighting these battles for decades. Daniel came with her, his presence reminding audiences that abstract principles had real human stakes. The house itself underwent remarkable transformation. The restoration work that Western Resources had offered as settlement came instead from volunteers, contractors who'd followed the case and donated labor, suppliers who provided materials at cost, architects who designed updates preserving historical character while adding modern utilities. Over 6 months, the stone ruins that had barely provided shelter evolved into actual home. Solar panels provided electricity. A well was drilled, bringing running water for the first time in decades. The roof was completely rebuilt with materials that would last another century. Windows were replaced with energy-efficient versions that still matched the original aesthetic. Heating system was installed that supplemented the fireplace without replacing its central role. The hidden chamber remained secret, its gold providing financial security. Rachel accessed sparingly. She sold enough coins to fund the foundation's operations and Daniel's therapy equipment, but left the majority untouched. Inheritance for future emergencies. Proof that her great-grandfather's sacrifice had achieved its intended purpose across a century's delay. Daniel thrived in ways that surprised even Dr. Martinez, who made house calls that transformed from medical necessity into genuine friendship. The quiet isolation that had initially concerned her proved beneficial for a child whose sensory processing made urban environments overwhelming. The space to explore safely, the consistency of routine, the reduced stimulation all contributed to development that might have been delayed further in settings designed for typical children. "He's doing remarkably well," Dr. Martinez observed during a visit when Daniel was 18 months old. He still wasn't walking independently, still communicated more through gesture than words, still showed characteristics of Down syndrome that would shape his entire life. But he was progressing, learning, engaging with his world in ways that demonstrated capability rather than limitation. "You proved everyone wrong," the pediatrician continued. "All the people who said you were being irresponsible, keeping him in ruins without proper services. All the suggestions that he'd be better off in care facilities with specialized programs. You understood what he needed better than any expert could have predicted." Rachel watched her son practice stacking blocks with a focused determination that characterized his approach to new skills. "I understood that he needed security more than services, needed home more than programs, needed mother who believed his disability didn't make him subject to whatever accommodation society was willing to provide." Everything else followed from that foundation. The property itself revealed additional secrets through restoration work. Behind walls that had seemed solid, workers found carved inscriptions documenting births, deaths, marriages, family history preserved in stone by people who'd understood that memory required physical anchoring in territory that could be defended. The inscriptions were photographed and cataloged, becoming part of historical record that contextualized Rachel's fight as continuation of lineage rather than isolated incident. One inscription in particular resonated with weight that made Rachel's throat tight. Carved near the fireplace in her great-grandfather's distinctive lettering. "Rosa Elena, born here 1920, protected here 1924, always home." Her grandmother's birth announcement, an implicit promise. This place had been built as refuge, had served that purpose during crises that spanned generations, would continue providing shelter for descendants who understood its significance. Alexandra Stern returned to film follow-up segment 18 months after the trial, documenting transformation from ruins to restored home. The visual contrast provided powerful before and after narrative, but Alexandra focused camera time on subtler changes. Daniel's development in secure environment, Rachel's evolution from desperate refugee to advocate for others facing similar circumstances, the community that had formed around supporting her resistance. "What would you tell other people facing corporate intimidation?" Alexandra asked during the final interview. Rachel considered the question while Daniel played nearby, his contentment evident in the relaxed way he explored toys arranged for his current developmental level. "Document everything. Find allies who understand the systems and can navigate them effectively. Accept that fighting requires resources and endurance most people don't possess easily. And understand that winning doesn't mean life becomes easy. It means you've established principles that matter beyond immediate comfort." Do you have regrets? Moments where accepting settlement would have been easier. Constantly. There were nights when Daniel cried from cold, when money for therapy would have helped him develop faster, when security seemed more valuable than principles. But easy and right aren't always the same thing. My great-grandfather understood that when he hid gold instead of using it to buy safety, he was teaching lesson across generations. Some things matter more than comfort. Some fights are worth having even when winning seems impossible. Some inheritances require courage instead of gratitude. The segment aired during prime time again, 22 minutes documenting transformation that had become national story about resistance and redemption. The response included book offers, speaking invitations, opportunities that could have transformed Rachel's advocacy into career, generating substantial income. She declined most of them. The foundation needed her attention more than her bank account needed inflation beyond what the gold provided. Other property owners needed support that fame couldn't deliver, but legal expertise and documentation could. And Daniel needed mother more than symbol, parent present for daily development rather than celebrity traveling for speaking engagements. The easement rights that had precipitated the entire conflict were ultimately leased to a regional water authority that agreed to terms respecting historical significance and providing ongoing revenue that funded foundation operations. The $4 million valuation that appraisers had established became actual payments spread over 30 years, creating endowment that would support property rights advocacy long after Rachel's immediate involvement ended. Western Resources Development filed bankruptcy as David had predicted, its assets liquidated to pay fines and restitution. Several successor companies attempted to purchase the corporate remnants, but federal oversight prevented reconstitution of criminal enterprise under different branding. The verdict had achieved what Rachel's great-grandfather couldn't: actual dismantling of organization that had been profiting from intimidation for over a century. 2 years after the trial concluded, Rachel stood on the porch her great-grandfather had built, watching Montana sunset paint the land in shades that made the isolation feel like feature rather than limitation. The house behind her was warm, secure, genuinely habitable in ways that transformed ruins into home. Daniel was inside with Margaret Chen, who'd become honorary grandmother through continued involvement that went beyond professional obligation. David Brennan pulled up in his truck, arriving for the foundation board meeting that brought together advocates who'd supported Rachel's fight and now worked to extend its lessons. Patricia from the library, Sarah from the Rural Property Defense Coalition, Jennifer Cole, who'd transformed local news segment into national conversation, Agent Reyes, who'd taken personal interest in seeing the case through to conclusion. They gathered around the table that volunteers had built from timber salvage from original outbuildings, discussing cases that needed support, strategies for legislative advocacy, educational programs that would teach property owners about rights they possessed but often didn't know how to exercise. Rachel listened to conversation that had become familiar, contributing insights from her experience while recognizing that her role was evolving from protagonist to mentor. Other property owners were facing different versions of the same fight. The foundation existed to ensure they didn't face it alone, didn't need to possess hidden gold or century-old documentation or stubborn willingness to risk everything. After the meeting concluded and others departed, David remained. He'd become something approaching family through shared struggle, his investment in the outcome going beyond professional responsibility into a personal mission shaped by his grandfather's failure to protect Rachel's great-grandfather. You know, the property is worth substantial amount now that restoration is complete and easement generates reliable income, he said carefully. If you wanted to sell, move somewhere with better services for Daniel, you'd have buyers immediately at prices that would provide genuine wealth. Rachel looked at the land that her great-grandfather had defended and her grandmother had preserved and she'd fought to claim. This isn't about property value. This is about principle that rights matter, that ownership means something, that one person with documentation and legal standing can face down power that assumes victory is guaranteed. If I sell because it's easier or more profitable, I invalidate everything we fought for. So you stay. We stay. Daniel deserves to grow up understanding his inheritance, not just the gold or the property, but the lesson that disability doesn't make you subject to terms others dictate. That legal rights means something when defended properly. That stubbornness and documentation and refusal to surrender can matter more than resources or connections. Inside, Daniel's laughter filtered through walls that had witnessed centuries of survival and resistance. Rachel heard her son's joy and felt certainty settle. They'd won more than legal victory. They'd won the right to exist in space they controlled, pursuing futures they defined, protected by principles her great-grandfather had documented and she defended. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant in darkness unpolluted by city light. Montana wind moved through grass that had witnessed violence and vindication both, carrying sound that might have been encouragement or might have been simply physics operating according to laws that preceded human drama. Rachel remained on the porch, watching night claim the land, thinking about ancestors she'd never met but felt she knew through the choices they'd made when choosing was hardest. Her great-grandfather building this house and hiding gold and documenting injustice that would eventually find audience. Her grandmother preserving both property and secrets across decades. Elena writing letters that warned and guided across centuries' distance. They'd all understood that some inheritances couldn't be spent or sold, could only be honored through continuation of work they'd started. Rachel had received ruins and gold and responsibility. She transformed the first, used the second, and embraced the third. The foundation would continue advocating. The house would continue sheltering. Daniel would continue developing an environment that prioritized security over services. And somewhere in archives and court records and media coverage, documentation existed that would help future property owners understand their rights and their power. Western Resources development was gone. Consolidated Western mining was footnote in historical records. But the principles they'd violated had been reinforced through prosecution that established precedent benefiting thousands of property owners who'd never know how Rachel's fight had protected their rights. That was enough. That was everything. Rachel went inside where her son waited, where warmth from the fireplace her great-grandfather had built still provided comfort against Montana cold, where walls that had survived centuries of storms continued standing witness to the truth that some things endured because people refused to let them fall. The gold remained hidden below, emergency fund and historical evidence both. The documents were preserved in fireproof safe, ready for the next person who'd need proof that resistance was possible. The house itself stood solid, testament to builders who'd understood that permanence required foundation deeper than simple construction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, therapy appointments, foundation business, ongoing maintenance of property that demanded constant attention. But tonight, mother and son were safe in home they owned, protected by legal rights they defended, surrounded by inheritance that meant more than money could measure. Some victories weren't dramatic. They were quiet affirmations that justice could function when pushed correctly, that documentation mattered, that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they refused to surrender principles for convenience. Rachel Torres had inherited ruins. She transformed them into fortress and refuge both. She'd fought companies that had been winning for over a century. She'd established precedent that would protect others she'd never meet. And most importantly, she taught her son the lesson that mattered most. That disability didn't define limitation. That rights were worth defending even when winning seemed impossible. That inheritance sometimes came wrapped in obligation rather than gift. The fire crackled in the hearth. Daniel dozed against her shoulder. Montana night pressed close around walls that had weathered everything and still stood. They were home. They were safe. They had won. And the inheritance of gold and property and principle and stubborn determination would continue protecting them and others for generations yet to come. The fight was finished. The legacy secured. The future, however uncertain, belonged to them. Outside, wind moved through empty land that wasn't empty at all, carrying memory of everyone who'd stood here and refused to be moved. Everyone who'd understood that some ground was worth defending regardless of cost. Rachel closed her eyes and felt her great-grandfather's presence like benediction, his century-long wait for vindication finally complete. His gold had funded the fight. His documentation had provided evidence. His sacrifice had meant something beyond personal tragedy. She hoped he knew. Hoped Rosa and Elena knew. Hoped all the ancestors who'd built and defended and preserved understood that their work had mattered, that inheritance had reached the right person at the right time, that principles had outlasted the people who'd tried to crush them. The house settled with sounds that spoke of age and endurance both. Daniel's breathing steadied into sleep. Rachel held her son and felt gratitude for ruins that had become refuge, for gold that had funded justice, for family she'd never met but felt she'd honored through choices that weren't always easy but were always right. Some stories end with dramatic victory. Others end with quiet recognition that persistence matters more than spectacle, that documentation outlasts violence, that one person's refusal to surrender can reshape how power operates across generations. This story ended with mother and son safe and home they defended, surrounded by land they owned, protected by legal precedent they'd established. Ended with foundation that would help others. Ended with inheritance transformed from burden into blessing. Ended, most importantly, with proof that justice could function when ordinary people possessed extraordinary courage. The inheritance had been claimed. The fight had been won. The future had been secured. And in ruins that had become home, Rachel Torres held her son and knew that everything her great-grandfather had sacrificed, everything her grandmother had preserved, everything she'd fought for had been worth the cost. They were home. They were safe. They had won. And that victory, however hard-earned, would echo forward through generations yet to come.